Imagine a pope who turned the Vatican into a den of debauchery, a spiritual leader who gambled with sacred treasures, ordained children for money, and died in the bed of a married woman. This is not fiction. This is the true story of Pope John the most scandalous pontiff in Catholic history. His reign was so corrupt, so violent, and so morally bankrupt that it nearly destroyed the credibility of the papacy itself. What you're about to hear will shock you, disturb you, and forever change how you view the medieval church. In the 10th century, when Christianity held absolute power over Europe, one man wielded that power not for salvation, but for sin. Pope John the Fiend was a monster in holy robes, a predator with a golden crown, and a symbol of everything that could go wrong when absolute power falls into corrupt hands. His story is a descent into darkness, a cautionary tale of how the highest spiritual office on earth became a throne of depravity. This documentary will take you through the horrifying details of his reign, from his shocking election at age 18 to his mysterious death during an alleged act of adultery. We will explore the political machinations that brought him to power, the unspeakable acts he committed within the sacred walls of the Vatican, and the devastating legacy he left behind. Prepare yourself for a journey into one of history's darkest chapters. Before we begin, a word of caution. The events described in this documentary are historically documented, but deeply disturbing. They involve sexual violence, corruption, murder, and the systematic abuse of religious authority. If you find such content difficult, viewer discretion is advised. But if you wish to understand how far humanity can fall, even in the name of God, then stay with us as we uncover the truth about Pope John XIII. The rise of a boy pope. To understand the horror of Pope John XIII, we must first understand the world that created him. The year was 955 AD, and Rome was not the eternal city of glory, but a crumbling fortress of political intrigue and violence. The papacy had become a prize to be seized by powerful families, not a sacred office earned through piety and wisdom. In this chaotic landscape, a boy named Octavian was born into privilege and power, destined for a throne he would desecrate. Octavian was the son of Alberic II, the ruler of Rome and effective dictator of the papal territories. Alberic wielded more power than any pope of his time, controlling the city with an iron fist and reducing successive pontiffs to mere ceremonial figures. He understood that whoever controlled the papacy controlled not just spiritual authority, but vast wealth, military forces, and political influence across Europe. And so, on his deathbed, Alberic made the Roman nobility swear an oath that would change history. The oath was simple but devastating. When the current pope died, Alberic's son Octavian would be elected as his successor. This was not a request based on spiritual merit or divine calling. This was dynastic succession imposed on the church itself, transforming the papacy into a hereditary monarchy. The nobles, bound by fear and self-interest, agreed. They knew that refusing Alberic could mean their death, and supporting his plan could mean their enrichment. When Pope Agapetus II died in 955, Octavian was merely 18 years old. He had received no theological training, demonstrated no spiritual calling, and shown no interest in religious life. His youth had been spent in the pursuit of pleasure, hunting, gambling, and womanizing. Yet through the machinations of his father's legacy, he was thrust onto the throne of St. Peter and took the name John the Fiend, becoming one of the youngest popes in history. The election itself was a mockery of sacred tradition. There was no divine inspiration, no consultation of the faithful, no consideration of candidates of virtue. It was a political transaction, pure and simple. The Roman nobility gathered not to pray for guidance, but to fulfill an oath made to a dying tyrant. When they announced Octavian as Pope John the Fiend, they knew exactly what they were doing, placing a young, inexperienced libertine in control of Christianity's most powerful institution. From the moment he assumed the papal throne, John V made it clear that he had no intention of living like a monk. The Vatican, which should have been a place of prayer and contemplation, became his personal playground. The sacred halls echoed not with hymns, but with the sounds of gambling, drinking, and debauchery. The papal palace, once a symbol of Christian authority, transformed into something more resembling a brothel than a holy residence. Historical chronicles from the period paint a disturbing picture. John XIV surrounded himself not with theologians and saints, but with courtiers, gamblers, and prostitutes. He appointed friends and lovers to positions of power within the church, selling bishoprics and sacred offices to the highest bidder. The spiritual needs of Christendom were irrelevant to him. What mattered was pleasure, power, and profit. The people of Rome watched in horror as their spiritual leader descended into depravity. Pilgrims who came to the Vatican seeking blessings found instead a court of corruption. Priests who expected guidance received only contempt. The faithful, who believed the Pope to be Christ's representative on earth, witnessed behavior that would shame the most dissolute of secular rulers, and yet there was nothing they could do. John the Fiend held absolute power, and anyone who challenged him risked exile, imprisonment, or death. A cathedral of sin. What happened within the walls of the Vatican during John the Fiend's reign defies belief, yet it is recorded in multiple historical sources. The Lateran Palace, seat of the papacy, became a scene of such depravity that even hardened chroniclers struggled to describe it. Bishop Liutprand of Cremona, a contemporary observer, documented acts so shocking that his accounts were later censored by embarrassed church officials. But the truth, however uncomfortable, must be told. John the XIV converted the sacred papal residence into what can only be described as a pleasure palace. He held lavish parties that lasted for days, filled with gambling, excessive drinking, and sexual activity. The Pope himself participated enthusiastically, openly keeping mistresses within the Vatican and making no attempt to hide his affairs. Women of all stations, from noble women to common prostitutes, were brought into the papal chambers for the Pope's amusement. The gambling was particularly notorious. John the XIV wagered vast sums of money, including church treasures and sacred relics, on games of dice and cards. Historical accounts describe him invoking pagan gods during these gambling sessions, calling upon Jupiter and Venus for luck while sitting on the throne of Christianity's supreme pontiff. This was not mere hypocrisy. It was deliberate blasphemy, a conscious rejection of the faith he was supposed to defend. But the gambling and drinking were merely symptoms of a deeper moral corruption. John the Fiend used his papal authority to exploit women on a systematic scale. Contemporary sources accuse him of adultery with married women, including the wives of Roman nobility. More disturbingly, he allegedly assaulted female pilgrims who came to Rome seeking spiritual guidance. These women traveled hundreds of miles, enduring hardship and danger, only to be victimized by the man they believed to be God's representative on earth. One particularly horrifying account involves a widow named Stephania. According to Bishop Liutprand, John the Fiend maintained a relationship with Stephania that went beyond mere adultery. She allegedly wielded significant influence over papal decisions, effectively running aspects of church governance from her position as the Pope's mistress. When she eventually died, rumors spread that John the Fiend had directly caused her death, though whether through violence or other means remains unclear. What is certain is that her death was sudden, convenient, and suspiciously timed. The Pope's sexual depravity extended to his abuse of religious institutions themselves. He reportedly ordained bishops and priests not based on their spiritual merit, but on their willingness to procure women for him. The sacrament of ordination, one of Christianity's most sacred rites, became a tool for building a network of enablers and accomplices. Men who should have been shepherds of souls instead became pimps for a pope. Even more shocking were the accusations of incest. Multiple chroniclers claim that John VIII had sexual relations with his own niece and his father's concubine. If true, these acts represented the ultimate violation of both natural and divine law. They demonstrated a complete absence of moral restraint, a willingness to transgress every boundary of decency. The Vatican, meant to be a beacon of morality, had become a monument to sin. The violence was equally terrible. John XIII did not simply indulge in pleasure. He punished those who opposed him with terrifying brutality. He ordered the mutilation of a cardinal who criticized his behavior, having the man's eyes gouged out and his tongue cut off. Another opponent, a deacon who spoke publicly about the Pope's sins, was castrated and left to die of his wounds. These were not judicial punishments, but acts of sadistic revenge, designed to terrorize anyone who might challenge papal authority. The corruption of sacred office. While John XII's personal depravity was horrifying, his systematic corruption of church institutions did even greater damage to Christianity. He transformed the papacy from a spiritual office into a commercial enterprise, selling every aspect of church authority to the highest bidder. This practice, known as simony, was explicitly forbidden by canon law and considered one of the gravest sins a church official could commit. Yet John XIII practiced it openly, without shame or remorse. The sale of bishoprics became routine under his rule. Wealthy nobles could purchase positions as bishops, abbots, or cardinals, regardless of their qualifications or character. These positions came with vast estates, income from tithes, and political power. For John V, they were simply assets to be liquidated for personal enrichment. The spiritual consequences, the damage to the church's mission, the scandal to the faithful, these meant nothing to him. One particularly egregious case involved the ordination of a 10-year-old boy as bishop. The child's father, a wealthy Roman nobleman, paid an enormous sum for this appointment. The boy had received no theological education, taken no holy orders, and could barely read the Latin prayers he was supposed to recite. Yet he was consecrated as bishop in a formal ceremony, with all the sacred rituals performed by Pope John V himself. This was not merely corruption, it was sacrilege, a mockery of everything the church claimed to represent. The Pope also sold sacred relics and church treasures, objects that had been donated by the faithful, relics of saints that people venerated, precious manuscripts and artworks. All were fair game for John XII's gambling debts and lavish spending. He stripped churches of their ornaments, melted down sacred vessels for their precious metals, and auctioned off items that should have been protected as part of Christianity's heritage. The Vatican's treasury, accumulated over centuries, was systematically plundered by its supposed guardian. His financial corruption extended to the exploitation of pilgrims. Rome, in the 10th century, was one of Christianity's most important pilgrimage sites. Drawing thousands of faithful from across Europe, these pilgrims brought offerings, purchased indulgences, and contributed to the church's coffers. Under John XIII, this system became overtly exploitative. Pilgrims were charged exorbitant fees for papal blessings, forced to pay bribes to gain audiences with church officials, and subjected to various schemes designed to extract their money. The Pope's court became infamous for its venality. Every service, every sacrament, every official act of the church came with a price tag. Want a marriage annulled? Pay the Pope. Need a dispensation from some inconvenient church law? Pay the Pope. Seeking a papal pardon for your sins? Pay the Pope. The spiritual economy of salvation, which should have been based on repentance and grace, became a simple cash transaction. Faith meant nothing. Money meant everything. This corruption created a crisis of legitimacy for the entire church. When bishops are bought and sold like commodities, when the Pope himself is living in open sin, what moral authority does the church have to guide the faithful? Throughout Christian Europe, people began to question whether the institutional church had any connection to the teachings of Christ. This spiritual crisis would simmer for centuries, eventually contributing to the Protestant Reformation 500 years later. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of John XII's corruption was how it normalized such behavior. By openly practicing simony, nepotism, and exploitation, he set a precedent that other church officials followed. If the Pope could sell offices and keep mistresses, why couldn't bishops and abbots do the same? The rot spread downward through the ecclesiastical hierarchy, infecting the entire institutional structure. What had been occasional abuses became systematic corruption, political machinations, and military failures. John the Third was not content to limit his destructive influence to spiritual matters. He also involved himself deeply in the brutal political conflicts of 10th century Italy, with disastrous results. His father Alberic had maintained papal independence through military strength and diplomatic cunning. John the 18th possessed neither quality, yet he inherited the Papal States, a patchwork of territories in central Italy that made the Pope both a spiritual leader and a secular ruler. The political situation was complex and dangerous. The Italian peninsula was divided among numerous competing powers. The Byzantine Empire controlled the south, various independent city-states dominated the center, and northern Italy was contested between local rulers and the distant Holy Roman Empire. The Papal States sat in the middle of this chaos, making the Pope a crucial player in Italian politics, whether he wanted to be or not. John XIII's primary enemy was Berengar II, King of Italy, who sought to expand his territory at the expense of the Papal States. Berengar was an experienced military leader and cunning politician, everything that John XIII was not. When Berengar's forces began threatening Rome itself, the young Pope found himself in desperate straits. His own military forces were inadequate, his political alliances were weak, and his personal behavior had made him few friends among Italy's other rulers. Faced with this crisis, John III made a fateful decision. He would invite Otto I, King of Germany, to invade Italy and defend the papacy. This decision had precedent. Charlemagne had been crowned Holy Roman Emperor by a pope in 800 AD, but it was still incredibly risky. By inviting a powerful foreign ruler into Italy, John XIV was essentially admitting his own weakness and potentially creating a new master who might be even more dangerous than Berengar. Otto I was everything John XIV was not: disciplined, pious, militarily competent, and politically astute. He had consolidated his power in Germany and was looking for an opportunity to expand his influence into Italy. The Pope's invitation was exactly what he needed. In 961, Otto crossed the Alps with a powerful army, quickly defeated Berengar's forces, and marched on Rome. John the Fiend, who had summoned him, now had to deal with the consequences. On February 2nd, 962, in a ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica, John the Fiend crowned Otto as Holy Roman Emperor. This was supposed to be John XIII's triumph, a restoration of papal authority through alliance with a powerful protector. But the reality was very different. Otto was now not just the Pope's ally, but his sovereign. The emperor had effective control over Rome and the Papal States, and John XIII had become little more than his chaplain. Otto V was also deeply troubled by what he witnessed in Rome. As a genuinely religious man, he was shocked by the corruption and depravity of the papal court. He saw John XII's behavior not as mere personal failing, but as a threat to Christianity itself. The emperor began to realize that installing this pope had been a mistake, and that perhaps the papacy itself needed reform. The relationship between the two men, never warm, began to deteriorate rapidly. The situation grew worse when Otto imposed conditions on his protection of the papacy. He demanded that the Pope swear an oath never to negotiate with Berengar or other enemies of the empire without Otto's permission. He insisted on approval rights for certain papal appointments. Most humiliatingly, he made it clear that the Pope's secular authority over Rome and the Papal States now existed only with imperial consent. John XIII had exchanged one master for another, and the new one was far more controlling. The ultimate betrayal. John XII's response to Otto's domination was characteristically treacherous. Rather than accept his diminished status or attempt to reform his behavior, The Pope immediately began plotting against the emperor who had saved him. This betrayal would prove to be one of the most consequential acts of his entire reign, setting in motion events that would expose his corruption to all of Christian Europe and fundamentally alter the relationship between Pope and Emperor. As soon as Otto left Rome to deal with Berengar's remaining forces in northern Italy, John XIV began secret negotiations with his former enemies. He sent envoys to Berengar offering an alliance against Otto. He contacted the Byzantine Empire, hoping to play east against west. He even reached out to the Magyar raiders who were terrorizing Eastern Europe, offering them tribute if they would attack Otto's territories in Germany. The Pope, who had invited Otto to save him, was now trying to orchestrate his downfall. The Pope's conspiracy was not subtle. He made little effort to hide his communications, and his envoys were indiscreet. Word of his treachery quickly reached Otto, who was both furious and disgusted. The emperor had risked his army, spent enormous resources, and solemnly committed himself to protecting the papacy. In return, John the Fiend had betrayed him at the first opportunity. This was not political calculation, it was personal treachery of the worst kind. Otto's response was swift and decisive. In November 963, he marched his army back to Rome and demanded that John the Fiend appear before him to answer charges of treachery. The Pope, realizing his plot had been discovered, fled the city in panic. He took with him as much portable wealth as he could carry, including sacred treasures from the Vatican, and sought refuge in the fortified town of Tivoli, about 20 miles from Rome. From there, he sent defiant messages to Otto, refusing to appear or to acknowledge any wrongdoing. With John the Third in hiding and refusing to defend himself, Otto took an unprecedented step. He convened a church synod, a formal assembly of bishops and clergy, and put the Pope himself on trial. This was extraordinary. Popes were considered to be answerable only to God, not to emperors or even to other church officials. The ancient maxim was, "The first see is judged by no one." Yet here was Otto, assembling the church's own leaders to judge the Pope's fitness for office. The synod, held in November 963, heard testimony about John XIV's conduct from numerous witnesses. Bishop Liutprand of Cremona, who was present, recorded the proceedings in detail. The charges were staggering in their scope and severity. The bishops heard evidence of adultery, incest, simony, gambling, blasphemy, murder, mutilation of opponents, and political betrayal. Witness after witness testified to acts that, if proven, would make John XIV not just an unfit pope, but one of the most depraved individuals to ever hold religious office. One particularly damning testimony came from Cardinal Benedict, who had served in John XIV's inner circle before breaking with him. Benedict described in detail the Pope's sexual activities, naming specific women, including his own niece and his father's concubine. He testified about the ordination of the 10-year-old bishop and provided documentation of various simony transactions. Most shockingly, he produced witnesses who swore that John the Fiend had invoked pagan gods during his gambling sessions and had performed a satanic mass in mockery of Christian ritual. The synod sent a formal summons to John the Fiend, giving him the opportunity to appear and defend himself against these charges. The Pope's response was characteristic. He sent back a letter so filled with curses and obscenities that the bishops were shocked. He threatened to excommunicate everyone who had participated in the synod. He declared that even if the charges were true, he, as Pope, was answerable to no earthly authority. He refused to appear, refused to defend himself, and made clear his complete contempt for any attempt to hold him accountable. Deposition and chaos. Faced with John XIV's refusal to appear and the overwhelming evidence of his crimes, the synod took a momentous step. They voted to depose him as Pope. On December 4th, 963, the assembled bishops formally declared John XIV unfit for office and stripped him of his papal authority. They cited not only his betrayal of Otto, but the full catalogue of his moral and spiritual failures. The official statement read at the synod was devastating in its denunciation, calling John XIII a criminal and blasphemer who had turned the papacy into a scandal. The deposition of a sitting pope was virtually unprecedented. While there had been cases of anti-popes and rival claimants, the Church had no clear mechanism for removing a validly elected pontiff. Canon law held that the Pope had supreme authority within the Church and could not be judged by any human institution. Yet the bishops, faced with John XII's depravity and supported by Otto's military power, decided that some lines could not be crossed even by the successor of St. Peter. Having deposed John XIII, the synod immediately moved to elect a replacement. Their choice was Leo X, a respectable Roman layman who was consecrated as pope within days. The election was irregular, conducted under imperial pressure and without the participation of the College of Cardinals, but Otto and the bishops considered it necessary. They believed that removing the corrupt John the Fiend and installing a decent man would restore order to the Church and legitimacy to the papacy. John the Fiend, hiding in Tivoli, refused to accept his deposition. He declared the synod invalid, Leo VIII a usurper, and maintained that he remained the true pope. He began gathering military forces, calling in favors from nobles who owed him their positions, and preparing to retake Rome by force. The situation descended into open warfare, with two men claiming to be pope and armies preparing to fight over control of the Eternal City. Otto, confident in his military superiority and believing Leo VIII's position secure, left Rome in early 964 to address problems in northern Italy. This was a fatal mistake. As soon as the emperor and his army departed, John VI's supporters within Rome began agitating for his return. Secret negotiations took place between Roman nobles who had benefited from John VI's corruption and wanted their patron back. Within weeks, a conspiracy was ready to act. In February 964, John VI's forces attacked Rome. The city's defenses, weakened by Otto's departure and undermined by traitors within, quickly collapsed. Leo VIII fled for his life, barely escaping capture. John XIV triumphantly returned to the Lateran Palace, declaring himself restored to the papacy and calling for vengeance against all who had opposed him. The brief hope for reform was shattered, and Rome was once again under the control of its depraved pontiff. John XIII's revenge was terrible. He convened his own synod, declared the previous synod invalid, and ordered the punishment of everyone who had testified against him. Several bishops who had participated in his deposition had their tongues cut out. Others were blinded or mutilated. Some fled into exile, abandoning their dioceses to escape the Pope's wrath. The violence was systematic and public, designed not just to punish enemies, but to terrorize anyone who might challenge papal authority in the future. Cardinal Benedict, who had provided the most damning testimony at the original synod, suffered a particularly gruesome fate. John XIII ordered him castrated, mutilated, and paraded through the streets of Rome as an example. The cardinal died from his wounds several days later, crying out against the Pope who had condemned him. His death became a rallying cry for John XIII's opponents, proof that the Pope was not just corrupt, but actively murderous. A death shrouded in scandal, John XIII's return to power would be short-lived, ending in a manner that was both fitting and controversial. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed by historians, with multiple conflicting accounts recorded by contemporary chroniclers. What is certain is that the Pope died suddenly on May 14, 964, barely 3 months after his return to Rome. What is also certain is that his death was surrounded by scandal and involved circumstances that confirmed everything his critics had said about his character. The most widely reported account, preserved by multiple sources, states that John XIII died while committing adultery. According to this version, the Pope was in bed with a married woman when he suffered a sudden stroke or seizure. Some sources claim the woman was Stephania, the widow who had been his long-term mistress, though others identify her differently. The Pope, struck down in the very act of sin, allegedly lingered for several days in agony before dying without receiving the last rites or making confession. Another version of events, reported by Bishop Liutprand among others, claims that John the Fiend was murdered by the cuckolded husband of the woman he was seducing. According to this account, the husband returned home unexpectedly, discovered the Pope with his wife, and beat John the Fiend to death in a rage. The murder was then covered up as a natural death to avoid scandal, though rumors of the true circumstances spread quickly throughout Rome and beyond. A third possibility, less sensational but perhaps more plausible, is that John Fiend died of natural causes, but that his enemies deliberately spread scandalous stories to discredit him even in death. The sudden death of a relatively young man was unusual enough to invite speculation, and the Pope had made enough enemies to ensure that the worst possible interpretation would be given to any mysterious circumstances. Whether he died during adultery, was murdered by a jealous husband, or simply had a stroke, his reputation ensured the most damaging story would prevail. What cannot be disputed is that John the Fiend died without spiritual preparation. Medieval Christianity placed enormous importance on deathbed confession and the last rites, believing that the state of one's soul at the moment of death determined one's eternal fate. A sudden death without time for confession was considered spiritually disastrous. That the Pope himself should die this way, apparently caught in sin, struck contemporaries as divine judgment. If anyone needed God's mercy, it was John Fiend, yet he died in circumstances that suggested he would receive none. The immediate aftermath of John the Fiend's death was chaotic. His supporters initially tried to maintain control of Rome, but without their leader, the coalition quickly fractured. Various factions began maneuvering for advantage, each with their own candidate for Pope. Otto I, upon hearing of John the Fiend's death, rushed back to Rome with his army to ensure that Leo X, his preferred candidate, would be restored to the papacy. The brief power vacuum demonstrated how much John the Fiend's personal authority, corrupt as it was, had held his faction together. John the Fiend was buried in the Lateran Basilica, the traditional resting place of popes. There was no elaborate funeral, no outpouring of grief from the faithful, no miracles reported at his tomb. His burial was a quiet affair, attended by only a few loyalists. The contrast with the funerals of previous popes could not have been more stark. Where they had been mourned as spiritual fathers and saints, John the Fiend was buried like a criminal, quickly and without ceremony, as if the church itself wanted to forget him as rapidly as possible. The question of John the Fiend's salvation troubled medieval theologians. How could God allow such a man to hold Peter's chair? If the Pope was supposed to be Christ's vicar on earth, guided by the Holy Spirit, how could John the Fiend have been so corrupt? Some argued that his election was invalid from the start, being based on his father's political machinations rather than divine will. Others claimed that God had allowed evil to occupy the papacy as a test of the faithful or punishment for the sins of Christians. Still others simply refused to discuss it, finding the entire subject too disturbing. The aftermath and historical judgment. The death of John the Fiend did not immediately resolve the crisis he had created. His reign had demonstrated that the papacy could be corrupted, that sacred office was no guarantee of virtue, and that the entire institutional structure of the church might be fundamentally compromised. These revelations sent shockwaves through Christian Europe that would reverberate for centuries. The question of how to prevent another John the Fiend became one of the central concerns of church reform movements for the next several hundred years. Immediately after his death, Leo VIII was restored to the papacy with Otto's support, but his legitimacy was always questionable. Many considered John the Fiend to have been the true pope until his death, making Leo V an anti-pope despite the support of the emperor and the synod. This dispute created a canonical mess that took decades to resolve. Later, historians would debate which of them should be counted in the official list of popes, with some numbering systems, including both and others, excluding one or the other. The scandal of John the Athene also fundamentally altered the relationship between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. Otto the Firm and his successors believed they had the right and duty to intervene when popes proved corrupt or incompetent. They claimed the authority to approve or reject papal elections, to convene synods, and even to depose popes who violated their duties. This position, which became known as Caesaropapism, led to centuries of conflict between emperors and popes over who had ultimate authority in Christendom. The memory of John XIII haunted subsequent papal elections. Electors became more cautious, paying attention not just to candidates' political connections, but also to their character and reputation. The College of Cardinals gradually developed more formal procedures designed to prevent the elevation of clearly unfit individuals. While corruption never entirely disappeared from papal elections, the spectacular disaster of John the Fiend made it harder for similarly depraved figures to gain the throne of St. Peter. Medieval chroniclers struggled with how to record John the Fiend's reign. Some, like Liutprand of Cremona, documented his crimes in explicit detail, believing that the truth needed to be preserved as a warning. Others, more concerned with protecting the church's reputation, wrote more circumspectly or omitted the most scandalous details. A few simply refused to discuss his reign at all, skipping from his predecessor to his successor as if John XIII had never existed. This historical erasure was itself a form of judgment. The Protestant Reformation, occurring 5 centuries after John IV, frequently cited him as evidence of Catholic corruption. Protestant polemicists used his reign to argue that the papacy had fallen away from true Christianity and that the entire institutional church was corrupt beyond reform. Catholic counter-Reformation writers, in response, tried to minimize John IV's significance or argue that his personal failings did not invalidate the office itself. The theological battles over his legacy became part of the larger war over the nature and authority of the Church. Modern historians have debated the accuracy of the contemporary accounts. Some argue that the reports of John V's depravity were exaggerated by his political enemies, particularly Otto the Firm and his supporters who needed to justify deposing a pope. They point out that many of the most shocking claims come from Liutprand of Cremona, who was hardly an objective observer. They suggest that while John the First was certainly corrupt and unfit for office, he may not have been quite as monstrous as the sources suggest. However, the weight of evidence is difficult to dismiss entirely. Multiple independent sources report similar behaviors. The actions taken by the Synod and Otto suggest that contemporaries genuinely believed the charges were true. The fact that John XIII never seriously defended himself, instead responding with threats and violence, indicates consciousness of guilt. While we may never know every detail with certainty, the broad outline of his corrupt and depraved reign seems historically solid. He was, by any reasonable standard, one of the worst popes in history. The broader context of papal corruption. To truly understand John XIII, we must place him in the broader context of what historians call the Saeculum Obscurum, or Dark Age of the papacy. This period, roughly from 904 to 964 AD, saw the papal office repeatedly controlled by corrupt Roman noble families, who treated it as political property rather than sacred trust. John XIII was the product of this system, not an aberration from it. His father Alberic had controlled Rome through force and passed that control to his son along with the papal throne. This was dynasty, not divine selection. The Saeculum Obscurum included several other scandalous popes, though none quite matched John XIV's spectacular depravity. Pope Sergius III allegedly ordered the murder of his 2 predecessors and kept a teenage mistress who later helped install her own son as pope. Pope John Fex was smothered to death by political rivals. Pope Stephen VII had his predecessor's corpse exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, and put on trial in the grotesque cadaver synod. The period was characterized by violence, corruption, and the complete subordination of spiritual concerns to political ambition. What made John V particularly notable, even in this terrible period, was the systematic nature of his corruption and the young age at which it began. Previous corrupt popes had at least maintained some pretense of piety or waited until they had consolidated power before indulging their vices. John V made no such efforts. From the moment of his election at age 18, he openly lived a life of sin and made no apologies for it. This shamelessness, this complete absence of conscience, set him apart even among bad popes. The societal factors that enabled John V are important to understand. 10th century Europe was incredibly violent and unstable. The Carolingian Empire had collapsed, leaving a power vacuum that numerous competing forces tried to fill. Viking raids terrorized northern Europe, Magyar invasions threatened from the east, and Saracen pirates controlled the Mediterranean. In this chaos, raw power mattered more than moral authority. A pope who could maintain control of Rome through any means necessary might seem preferable to one whose piety rendered him politically impotent. Additionally, the extreme wealth and power of the papacy created enormous incentives for corruption. The Pope controlled vast estates, collected taxes from across Europe, wielded the spiritual weapon of excommunication, and could make or break political careers through the granting or withholding of legitimacy. For ambitious noble families, capturing the papacy meant access to wealth and power on a scale that secular offices could not match. The fact that it also required taking religious vows and maintaining at least a facade of piety was a small price to pay for such enormous rewards. The isolation of Rome also played a role. Communication in the 10th century was slow and difficult. Reports of papal misconduct took months to reach the far corners of Christian Europe, and by the time they did, they had often been garbled or dismissed as rumors. Even when credible reports did circulate, distance made it nearly impossible for anyone outside Italy to do anything about them. The Pope could behave as he wished, secure in the knowledge that most Christians would never know the truth, and those who did were too far away to intervene. The theological concept of papal infallibility, which would not be formally defined until the 19th century but was already implicit in medieval thought, created a paradox. If the Pope, as successor of Peter, enjoyed special divine protection and authority, how could that same Pope be so corrupt? Some medieval thinkers resolved this by distinguishing between the office and the man. The papacy itself was holy, even if the individual pope was sinful. Others argued that a truly evil pope was not really pope at all, his election being invalid from the start. Still others saw corrupt popes as divine punishment for the sins of Christians. The legacy of John XIII and the Saeculum Obscurum eventually prompted significant reforms. In the 11th century, a movement arose that sought to liberate the Church from secular control and establish clearer standards for papal elections and clerical behavior. The Gregorian Reform, named after Pope Gregory VII, attempted to address many of the issues that John V's reign had exposed. While never completely successful, these reforms did help create a more professional and less corrupt papal administration, though scandals continued to occur periodically throughout church history. Lessons from history. What can we learn from the horrifying story of Pope John XIII? First and foremost, that no institution, however sacred its mission, is immune to corruption when power is concentrated without accountability. The Catholic Church claimed to be guided by the Holy Spirit and protected by divine grace, yet it allowed an 18-year-old libertine to occupy its highest office and maintain that position through years of depravity. Good institutional design matters more than good intentions. Second, we learn that hereditary power and dynastic succession are inherently corrupting forces. John the Athene was not elected based on merit or virtue. He was installed because of his father's machinations and power. He had no training for the office, no spiritual calling, and no qualifications beyond being the right man's son. Any system that allows such individuals to reach positions of supreme authority is fundamentally flawed, regardless of whether we are discussing religious or secular institutions. Third, the story illustrates the danger of conflating spiritual and temporal power. The Pope was simultaneously a religious leader and a secular ruler, with authority over souls and control of armies. This combination created impossible conflicts and perverse incentives. To maintain his secular power, John the Athene had to make political and military decisions that often contradicted his supposed spiritual mission. To fund his lifestyle, he had to exploit the very spiritual authority he was supposed to protect. The dual nature of papal power corrupted both aspects. Fourth, we see the importance of transparency and the free flow of information. John V's reign was able to continue for years, partly because information about his behavior spread slowly and was often disbelieved. In our age of instant communication, such sustained deception would be much harder to maintain. While modern technology brings its own problems, it also makes large-scale corruption more difficult to conceal, creating at least some check on abuse of power. Fifth, the response to John V demonstrates both the possibility and the difficulty of institutional reform. Otto I and the Synod of Bishops showed that even the most powerful corrupt official can be held accountable when enough people of integrity are willing to act. However, the chaotic aftermath also shows how hard it is to implement reform when the existing system is deeply compromised. John the Athene's successful return to power, however brief, demonstrated that corruption creates its own constituency that will fight to maintain the corrupt system. Sixth, we learn about the gap between an institution's ideals and its reality. The Catholic Church proclaimed the highest moral and spiritual standards, while its supreme leader violated every principle it claimed to uphold. This hypocrisy was not lost on contemporaries and contributed to cynicism about religious authority that would eventually fuel the Protestant Reformation. Institutions that claim moral authority must be held to higher standards, not lower ones. And failure to meet those standards does far more damage than simple secular corruption. Finally, John V's story reminds us that individuals matter. While systemic factors created the conditions that allowed his rise to power, he made specific choices about how to use that power. He chose depravity over duty, personal pleasure over spiritual leadership, and revenge over mercy. Other popes faced similar circumstances and made better choices. We cannot excuse John XIV's actions by blaming the system alone. He bears personal moral responsibility for the harm he caused and the faith he betrayed. Today, more than 1,000 years later, Pope John X remains a cautionary tale. His name has become synonymous with papal corruption, a standard against which other bad popes are measured and usually found less terrible. Church historians regard his reign as one of the darkest periods in papal history, a time when the gap between Christian ideals and Christian reality was at its widest. His legacy is one of shame, a reminder of how far any institution can fall when power corrupts absolutely. Conclusion: Pope John V reigned for less than a decade, yet his impact on Christian history was profound and lasting. He demonstrated that the highest spiritual office in Christianity could be occupied by one of its least spiritual members. He showed that institutional authority, no matter how ancient or sacred, provides no guarantee against moral corruption. And he proved that power without accountability inevitably leads to abuse, regardless of how many prayers are said or how many religious rituals are performed. His crimes were numerous and terrible: adultery, incest, simony, blasphemy, murder, mutilation, political treachery, and the systematic corruption of sacred office. Each of these alone would make him unfit for the papacy, Taken together, they paint a picture of a man so morally bankrupt that his very existence in the papal role constituted an ongoing scandal. That he died as he lived, in circumstances of sin and shame, seemed to contemporaries like divine commentary on his entire life. Yet we must resist the temptation to treat John the Fiend as simply a monster, an inexplicable aberration in the history of Christianity. He was a product of his time and circumstances, elevated to power by a corrupt system that valued political connections over spiritual fitness. He was enabled by a structure that granted him absolute authority with minimal accountability. He was protected by theological doctrines that made deposing even a corrupt pope nearly impossible. Understanding these factors does not excuse his actions, but it helps us understand how they were possible. The story of Pope John the XIII forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about religious authority, institutional corruption, and the gap between ideals and reality. Can an institution claim to be guided by God when it places monsters in positions of supreme authority? What does accountability mean when the highest authority in an institution is answerable to no one? How do we distinguish between divine office and human failing when the same person embodies both? These questions have no easy answers, but they must be asked. For historians, John V remains an endlessly fascinating figure precisely because he was so terrible. His reign provides insight into the political chaos of 10th century Europe, the institutional weaknesses of the medieval church, and the human capacity for evil when unchecked by conscience or consequence. His story has been told and retold for a millennium, each generation finding new relevance in this ancient scandal. For believers, John IV presents a profound challenge to faith. How could God allow such a man to occupy Peter's chair? The traditional answer, that God permits evil as a test or for purposes beyond human understanding, may not satisfy everyone. Some have argued that John the XIII's reign demonstrates that the papacy is fundamentally flawed and that Christianity needs forms of organization that provide more accountability. Others maintain that even the worst pope cannot invalidate the divine foundation of the church itself. For skeptics, John the XIII provides powerful ammunition against claims of religious moral superiority. Here was a man who held the highest spiritual office in Christianity, who claimed to speak for God, who wielded the power to excommunicate and condemn, and yet he was by any measure a terrible human being. His example undermines arguments from religious authority and raises hard questions about whether religious institutions are any more moral than secular ones. What remains undeniable is the horrifying nature of what occurred during John the XIII's reign. The Vatican, which should have been a beacon of moral leadership, became a brothel. The papacy, which should have guided Christianity toward holiness, exemplified depravity. The successor of St. Peter, who should have been shepherding souls toward salvation, was preying on the faithful and selling sacred office for profit. These facts are historically documented and cannot be dismissed or explained away. As we conclude this documentary, we return to where we began, with the recognition that Pope John the XIII represents one of the darkest chapters in Christian history. His reign was a catastrophe for the Church, a scandal that resonated across centuries, and a warning about the corrupting influence of unchecked power. His name deserves to be remembered not with respect, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when the highest ideals are betrayed by those entrusted to uphold them. History judges Pope John V severely, and that judgment is entirely deserved. He was not just a bad pope, he was one of the worst human beings to ever claim divine authority, and his legacy remains one of shame and horror.